the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Destination Mecca by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Chapter 4. Eastward to Egypt. The street was wide. The fire brigade was marching gloriously by, no doubt for the best of reasons. Marseille lay bathed in watery sunshine. One whole day to wait for the ship to Egypt. Tangier seemed a million miles away. I sat in a shaded cafe terrace, and the waiter brought me Zimba Cola. I asked him why. "All Spaniards drink Zimba, monsieur." So I drank. Now here was a touch of mystery. Was this a password? Did I speak French like a Spaniard? Or was the man just a complete dolt, saying the first thing that came into his head? A very French-looking couple came in and carried on an animated discussion in the most Parisian of accents. Tensely I watched. Yes, they were being served with Zimba, all right. Imperiously they ordered espresso coffee. The waiter retreated, scowling. So this was Marseille. Very well, I would investigate further. I would be the mysterious Spaniard, here on important business. I would play the game to the end. I even shouted, "Caramba!" very loudly. The waiter scurried up, polishing a glass in the approved manner. For a moment I felt a bit foolish, but the pose was asserting itself. "Gracias," I told him, and slapped down a 50-franc note. October in Marseille, I told myself, and slouched out. As I walked through the shadiest quarters, trying to sense contacts with anyone and everything interesting, I began to realize that I might be the most sinister object in sight. Nobody offered me a doped cigarette, or even a run across to Tangier. I saluted strange-looking Arabs, who smiled back without a word about white slaves. True, one rather flashy youth badgered me for dollars, but I had none to exchange at the very favourable rate being offered. I spent most of the day looking for photogenic fishermen, and again inspected Hitler's immense Mercedes, which I had already seen on show in England. "Marseille," said an Englishman who lived in the same small hotel near the sea, "has been described as a place whose avoidance is in itself an achievement." I told him that it all depended upon what one wanted out of life. After that, I really began to like the place a little better myself. Here, at any rate, one could buy any quantity of really first-class fruit at low prices, sit or walk in the sunshine, go for a trip in painted boats to the famed Château d'If, and remember that this was the threshold of the Orient. I found no copy here for any of those papers which like to feed their readers on tales of sinister Marseille. As I watched one seemingly endless line of infantry marching past, en route to Indochina, I thought of these men and their fate. It seemed odd that vice and crime had a greater fascination for many readers than history in the violent making in the Far East. Somehow the time passed, and I could go on board the ship. In any case, I was not here to study France, and even the period on board could be little more than a time for thinking out the problems of getting to Mecca, performing the pilgrimage, getting pictures, and getting out. As I arrived at the docks and opened my bags for the customs official, he pointed dramatically at my dispatch case. In it were nothing more than several packets of enlarging paper, do not open except in the dark, and what he saw as a decidedly sinister-looking ampule of developer. Neither of these things would be opened, I was informed, if I would pay 200 francs on each. The logic of it was beyond me, and I refused. A porter was deputed by the exquisitely uniformed douanier, who stood aloof while my feeble mind was grappling with the details, to explain that, therefore, My hand baggage would be exempted from search as a favour. At the same time, monsieur, in order to spare yourself needless delay in the opening of the other articles, it would be best to pay 25 francs each. That will be 200 francs. This beat me. I paid. The bags were chalked. A douanier is as good as his word. As the official disappeared towards the nearest bar, the porters, as one man, winked and smiled affectionately, lifting an imaginary glass. After that, I cursed my luck for not having some desperately dutiable contraband with me. It was just as well that I had not, for I was treated with offended aversion by the Egyptian customs when I eventually arrived there. I got aboard the ship easily enough, in fact too easily, without passport or ticket, which I had laid down in the confusion of the douane shed. Now I found that all my attempts to go ashore again were met with the gravest suspicion by everyone I approached, to prevail upon the gangway soldiers to let me by. The ships of this line may not have the best possible food aboard, but none can deny that the fittings are luxurious. As usual, the dazzling figure in braid and the neatest of uniforms is just a minor functionary, not the captain. Literally hundreds of porters, all, so far as I could see, Arabs, were loading oil drums with block and tackle into our holds. One, the captain of porters, now too old for active work, reclined on a pile of sacks by the quay, reverently placed there for him by a disciple. The Eastern patriarchy seemed strangely out of place, and yet was it? There was something so monotonously hypnotic about the rhythmic chant of the small, lithe men, so unendingly recurrent were the shapes of standard-sized drums, seen in all their shapes and combinations there on the sling, so bright and silver in the true Mediterranean light, that my mind seemed to tire of taking photographs. Arabs, oil drums, oil, porters, old Baghdad, the panorama of the years, never far from the Oriental mind, seemed to flash through my brain. Leaning on the rails there in this 20th century, with thoughts of Aladdin's lamp, of the New East reinvigorated by petroleum, I let myself fall into that state of mind which I suppose Western psychologists would call auto-suggestive escapism, or something like that. The trouble with you people, an English professor friend had said to me once, is that you do not know which century you are living in. To you, Saladin or Suleiman the Magnificent are as real as anyone alive today, and I can prove it. He had gone on to tell me, I reflected, that the majority of Eastern languages had nothing except direct speech. I am here, said Alexander, is an example. It is not possible to say, Alexander said that he was there. This, the professor had maintained, was due to the fact that the speaker wanted the events related to be as near as possible, did not want them to appear so old, liked to feel that they had only just occurred, or were still happening. When we set sail, I spent much of my time at first watching the victorious Egyptian wrestlers and weightlifters who were returning home from The Hague, exercising on deck. I often saw their manager, himself once a world champion, coaching them. They were an extraordinarily assorted lot, physically speaking. Some with the characteristically almost negroid big heads and curly frizzy hair of Lower Egypt, others small, wiry and sensitive-faced, like the Arab, some of the common Mediterranean type that is called Alpine or Latin in Europeans, and Levantine elsewhere. This was something which had a bearing upon another problem which I had set out on my journey to analyze. To what extent can the Middle Eastern peoples be divided into distinct nations? Is their patriotism of the same nature as Western nationalism? Having regard to the fact that most of such peoples have no tradition of independent statehood stretching beyond 2 or 3 decades, are they nations at all, in the generally understood sense of the term? The answer to my first musings, as I had watched the oil drums, came before the nationality question. In the dining room I sat next to a rosy-cheeked priest, bound in the complicated itinerary for the Congo. He talked incessantly across me to a morose, black-bearded character who, when he did speak more than a monosyllable, seemed always to say, "When I was mayor of Ranajit." I changed places with him. This brought me face to face with the tall, shapely figure who never spoke at all. Like me, he passed his wine to the priest, so I took him for a Muslim. The 18 hours before we got underway was a period of continual din and shouting. Roaring forth the monotonous cries of their trade, the Arab stevedores were bringing more and more oil drums to the quay with a speed and dexterity which was almost frightening. Presided over by the aged Benoust patriarch, they seemed oblivious of anything else. A nod from their chief, the slightest gesture, and the teams, together numbering some 200, responded with complete coordination. Every 2 hours or so, when they had a short break, one or another brought a water pipe and mint tea to their leader. All first kissed his hand and then their own. This little cameo amused me, and I thought that I could make a little picture series of it. I had decided rather precipitately to go to Mecca, but since I left England there had not been much chance to familiarize myself with the rapid action camera that I had chosen for the job. I watched the ceremonies and activities of the workers, decided that I would develop my films on the ship so that if the results were not good enough, I could always buy another camera in Cairo if this one proved defective or unsuitable in any way. Innocent enough. But we were no longer in England. There is a sensitivity in the Mediterranean lands that someone from Britain, accustomed to free and easy ways, has to relearn. I had taken about 20 pictures in rapid succession when I felt a hand on my arm. A blue beret, typical bourgeois Frenchman stood beside me. "There are so many finer things to photograph in France," he said. "A man of your obvious refinement could picture beauty, rather than those sordid Arab workers. They are not of France. They work here only seasonally, like the carpet peddlers." He did not seem at all convinced when I tried to explain that, on the contrary, I thought it a pleasing sight that this little social unit maintained its own customs here. Being somewhat impatient by nature, his shrugging shoulders annoyed me. "In any case, is it not something that you French allow them to come here, to live their own way of life? And as to your remark about my supposed refinement, I have never set eyes on you before, let alone talk to you, so you have no idea what my intellectual or other attainments are, any more than I have of yours, and I am content, monsieur, to remain in such ignorance of you." Next morning at breakfast, this man pointed me out in a loud voice to a group of his compatriots as a dangerous anarchist or something similar. 2 days were to pass before I first got to grips with the mind of the East again. As I mused at the rails, staring out to sea, a voice addressed me from behind, "Peace upon thee," in Arabic. "Alaykum as-salam, on thee peace also," I said. Like something out of a medieval story, my Arab vis-a-vis at mealtimes bowed and spoke with dignity. "You bear a famous name, my brother. I have seen it on the passenger list. I, too, am of the Prophet's clan." He was of the old school. Let me tell you a story. It will introduce us. 13 centuries ago, our ancestor Muhammad, son of Abdullah of the mighty Quraysh clan, wiped infidelity and polytheism from pagan Mecca. In its place, as you know, he installed monotheism and the worship of the one true God. I bowed. It is customary in Muslim circles to start from a known beginning, developing your theme from remote history down until the present day, if necessary. The infidels, plus Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians, fell, humbled by the sword of truth and the preaching of Bedouin faith. The power of Islam swept westward, led by the conqueror Tariq, after whom Gibraltar, Jebel Tariq, is still named. A relative of Muhammad, the mighty Tariq reached Morocco, the farthest west known to us. Plunging his horse into the foaming Atlantic breakers, he brandished his sword aloft. O Allah, in thy name, if there be land beyond this sea, I shall conquer it, bearing witness to thy unity and omnipotence. There was fire in the old man's eyes, his mind visualizing the scene as though it had taken place but yesterday. I am directly descended from that man. Your ancestor, the Emperor Musa Kazim the Hashimi of the Prophet's house, was driven eastwards, and his progeny settled in Ajam, the lands of Persia, then Afghanistan, where they became lords and warriors. Infidelity reigned in Baghdad, but still the Muslim armies poured into Spain, overthrowing the Vandals, the Hispaniola, and the Castilian. On the mighty ranges of the Pyrenees, the Syed, my ancestor, stood at the head of his heroes. They looked down from the barren rocks into the fair, green, lush fields of France. On to the conquest of the world for Islam, thus shouted the captains. The Syed turned his horse and trod slowly away. No, we shall remain in Spain. France is too green, he said. My men would degenerate in that soft climate. Too green, he said. Thus it was that we gave time to Charles Martel to gather his forces, and the Moors were swept from Spain in the end. My family returned. They were one of the very few who escaped the Inquisition. Today they call me a Libyan. I live on a strip of land between the Sahara and the Mediterranean Sea. See how we are scattered, we progeny of the lords of Arabia. The nobility is no more. I was to find out that this mentality, the fusing of many ideas, is typical of Muslims today. In that man's words were all the elements that are firmly believed in the Middle East: the invincibility of Muslim arms, reverence for the Prophet's family, and, key to my pet problem of nationality, the lack of national partisanship on the Western model. You may be an Arab or a non-Arab, a Baghdadi or a man from Bokhara, but you are only in a secondary sense an Iraqi or even an Egyptian. Sa'di, the greatest Persian poet, reflected this in his writings. Ha mulk imast ki mulk I khuda imast. Every country is my homeland that is God's country. And this, in 1,000 ways I was to discover, stems from the essentially Islamic basis of nationalism in the Middle East. Western nationalism and political theory, as I had seen it, sprang from Socrates and Plato, from Marx and Rousseau, from rationalism allied to the natural affection of one whose soul is not so dead as not to recognize his native land. Muhammad, on the other hand, strove always to widen the circle of Islam, to include the believers as a nation rather than as a religious community in the theological sense. One reads in the histories of Islamic expansion of the conquest of the unbelievers rather than the conquest of Persia or India. This, to me, brought home again and again the reason why Islam has not lost its grip upon people in the way and to the extent that other religions have lost supporters. Islam has never set out to be a religion, in the same sense as these other creeds. It was by recognizing this fact that Jamaluddin el-Afghani became, in the 19th century, the Middle East's apostle of liberation and patriotism, while yet repudiating nationalism. Today, almost every single party or group, from Morocco to Java, claims him as its inspiration, however different their aims. I shall speak of him and his work later, in dealing with his spiritual successors as I come across them. A very great deal of nonsense has been written about the so-called pan-Islamic movement, much of it written by Orientalists who should know better. This is one fact which my journeys in Egypt and beyond amply proved. Flags were flying, motorboats sporting 1,000 fluttering pennants cruised madly round the ship, as tens of thousands of paid and unpaid supporters of the Egyptian athletes welcomed their heroes at Alexandria Harbour. Bow after bow they took, dressed especially in their tracksuits and sunglasses. Every minute the crowds thickened and became wilder. Music mounted in frenzied tempo that I could not but feel, uncharitably, I suppose, must be maintained at that pitch only because the players were high with hashish. Amid garlands and bouquets, through ranks of pashas 3 deep, and braving the batteries of cameras, the team stepped ashore to be chaired to their waiting banquet. It was morning, and the Cairo train did not leave for a few hours. We landed to put off time before the departure of the Desert Express. The least said about Alexandria, perhaps the better. The Khedive Muhammad Ali is reported to have said, "Egypt is now a part of Europe." It certainly did not seem at first sight to be part of the East. The heat, of course, was there. So were the flies and the usual drifting proletariat, shabby in its pathetic imitations of Western garb, looking thoroughly dispirited, which it is, and should be. Too many indifferent Orientals seem to have been turned into bad replicas of Europeans. The typical long jalaba or nightshirt, which is considered standard fellahin dress, is elegant in comparison with a pair of stained dungarees and a 10th-hand toupee. These characters were most in evidence in the streets. Garish stalls sold at enormous prices things that one would throw away in England. Broad, sweeping avenues built with a complete lack of taste formed concrete jungles, where the heat battled with cement dust for first place as indigenous pest. Sadly, I drank an American soft drink in the Baroque bar of the largest hotel, where befezed men about town dangled their gold-topped canes and dusted patent leather brogues, what taste, with silk handkerchiefs. A policeman, politely enough, saluted me and asked me for a tip. I gave him 5 piastres, a shilling, and he seemed content. There are some good beaches at Alexandria, where the capital's elite repair in summer to enjoy themselves. Huge American cars purr through the streets. A little outside the town centre, His Majesty King Ahmed Zog, monarch of all the Albanians, lived in lonely splendour, attended only by an entire cabinet, who followed him to this immense Riviera-type villa of his exile. One of my first impressions was the amazing depths to which Arabic has sunk as the language of the country. Still, it is always interesting to see what people can do with things, and what the Egyptians have done to Arabic may be noted almost as an example of human ingenuity. It is no exaggeration to say that if one spoke the literary kind of Arabic, which is the day-to-day tongue of the Arabian Peninsula, scarcely a soul in Alexandria would understand it. Before long I had, even in Cairo, to seek literature graduates from Al-Azhar University with whom to practice real Arabic. In spite of the fact that they feel themselves to be the natural leaders of the Arab world, the Egyptians often unbosom themselves to friends about their un-Arabishness. Their detractors, of course, call them Africans, and they do not like that a little bit. Many Egyptians feel that in some mysterious way the hand of imperialism must have caused all the ills or disadvantages from which they suffer. This story is related with relish by Egyptians, who seem immune to its implications for themselves. It is said that a British consular official was greatly alarmed at the headway which French was making in the land of the Nile. Lord Curzon, as he was passing through Cairo, was approached by this functionary. The British community, he said, besought his lordship's aid in popularizing English. Curzon is credited with having made a typical answer. French is good enough for the Egyptians. Alexandria, I reflected, was no place for me. Cairo was the gateway to Arabia. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.